Again, good evening, everybody. So my name's Sian Rees, for those who don't know, and I'm the Chairman of Trustees to the um, Cambrian Archaeological Association. My pleasant task to welcome you to the Cambrian Archaeological Association annual Christmas lecture. So just a note on housekeeping. It would be useful if people muted themselves, or if they are already muted, to keep themselves muted to avoid extraneous noises, dogs barking and telephones going and all that sort of stuff. And then at the end, when we ask for questions, you can use the chat box, or and don't forget to unmute yourself at that point when you're asking the question. So this is our annual Christmas lecture, and these Christmas lectures for the last few years have been covering a variety of topics for Welsh importance for Wales. But as befits a season of jollity and goodwill, characteristically they're on subjects which are very beautiful and very highly photogenic, and this 2024 lecture is certainly no exception to this. Welsh costume is a fascinating subject, rather perhaps more complicated than is often appreciated, but it's definitely beautiful. And Michael Freeman is the ideal person to tell us about it. He spent a lifetime studying the monuments and history and the people of Wales, firstly in museums in Pembrokeshire and Ceredigion, and since his retirement in the National Library, most recently compiling that most sublime of websites, Sublime Wales, and the early tourists of our country. So welcome, Michael, and thank you very much indeed for coming to deliver this lecture, and over to you.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me all right?
I certainly can. And
good. Let's hope everybody else is. Well, thank you very much indeed for inviting me to give this talk. This is one of my particular interests, and has been since I started reading tourist literature and realised what I thought I knew about Welsh costume was not what tourists said about it. And in fact, I've gathered nearly 100,000 words of descriptions by tourists of Welsh costume just on that subject, and also hundreds and hundreds of pictures, illustrations, paintings, and drawings and photographs. And I've tried to analyse that, but as you'll become aware, there is still a lot of questions that is very difficult to answer. And I am seriously thinking about doing a Yoloma Ganog and faking a few documents in order to answer some of those questions. So there's a lot of evidence that I've been able to gather during the last 30 years or so, covering about 250 years. That's from the 1770s, when tourists started coming to Wales in large numbers. But the subject hasn't been studied all that much. There's only a few serious publications on it. It's complex, confusing, and contradictory, the evidence is. When somebody said to me that when somebody says something is complex, they either don't understand it or don't want to talk about it. In my case, I'm very happy to talk about it for hours. I'm not going to. But there are answers which are really difficult to answer. What I have been able to show is that traditional Welsh costume did vary from place to place, but also, of course, from generation to generation. And most of the evidence we have comes from outsiders. There's very, very little written about Welsh costume by Welsh people in either language. There are a few bits of evidence in Welsh, particularly in magazines and newspapers, but most of that is late 19th, early 20th century, when the development of the Welsh costume had become a national costume, really. And then there are also quite strong views about Welsh costume, especially by those who think it's fake, because you may well know that Lady Llanover has been accused of creating, or at least recording, Welsh costume in the style that she thought it should be in, and I'll be talking about her later on. So some people think the whole thing is completely fake, as they also think the tartan in Scotland is fake. So my feeling is, sorry, there's something happening here. My feeling is that Welsh costume started off as a working costume and may go back centuries, but we've got so little information about any costume worn by the rural working people in Wales before 1770. There's a little bit, but it's very little. It started off as a working costume. It became a traditional costume in that a young woman would wear what her mother or aunt or grandmother wore without thinking about it. It was just what you did. Then that became recognized by tourists as a folk costume. And normally what they were seeing was their women's best costume that they saw when people were going to and from market, or what they wore on Sundays or at special events. And then finally, from the 1880s, we see it developing into a national costume. There was a demand in the 1880s for that. So I'll be summarising that later on. But I also want to look at the evidence, first of all, because the evidence is very patchy, which is why there are gaps in our knowledge. First of all, we've got nothing to compare it with in Wales, in England, Ireland, or Scotland, because there is no distinctive woman's costume in those parts of the UK. Normally men are representing them, but in Wales it's always been a woman, and the Welsh hat has become an icon of Wales. If the evidence is anything to go by, this is what men wore in Wales during the 18th and 19th century. We have almost no descriptions of men's costumes, very, very little indeed, compared with women's costumes, of which there's a vast amount. And that's mainly because I think tourists really found women and their costumes very attractive and wanted to write about them and illustrate them. We do have a few illustrations of men in the traditional costume, and this is a Datcaniad, a performer, really, wearing what probably many men in Wales wore at the time. And it's very similar to that worn in England, except, of course, it would have been homespun wool. So a blue jacket, waistcoat, a shirt underneath that, breeches and stockings, which were quite often blue. But that's about as much as we know about men's costumes. And the same applies to children's costumes. There's very little written about that. It's nearly all focused on women's costumes. But this young woman in Merionethshire is wearing very much what her mother would have worn in the 18th century. Quite a lot of costume survives, but almost all of it is late 19th, early 20th century. There's very, very little that I've been able to identify as being anything earlier than 1880, say, except for the hats. And there are a great many hats have survived, which we'll see in a moment. Then we have the very distinctive gown. It used to be called betgown or bedgown, but that is the wrong term. That term has really been applied to it by academics in the 20th century. But the proper term for the long-tailed item of clothing is a gown, and then the bedgown, or gunbach, is the correct term for this small jacket with short sleeves. And most of the original costume has probably ended up in rag rugs and patchwork. And so, as I say, there's very little surviving to actually study properly, except in dolls. Now, I mentioned that there are nearly 100,000 words written by tourists or for tourists about Welsh costume. And we have examples like this. This is a particularly good example. Most of them are shorter than this. So this is from a guidebook on the beauties of Anglesey and Carnarvonshire, written about 1830. And it says, the dress of the females, the lower orders, is pretty similar throughout the Principality. I would dispute that. And consists of a blue striped flannel petticoat. Well, it may have done in Anglesey and Carnarvonshire, but not in South Ceredigion, where they're red. A kind of bedgown of the same material, with loose sleeves, that's separate sleeves, which could be put on and taken off as required. A broad handkerchief over the neck and shoulders, a neat mob cap, and a man's beaver hat. in dirty or cold weather, the person is wrapped in a long blue cloak, and they wear blue, not red, as is generally thought, which descends below the knee, except when particularly dressed, i.e. on Sundays or special events. They go without shoes or stockings, and even if they have these luxuries, the latter in general have no feet for them, and I'll show you some illustrations of those in a moment. And there's a little bit, as I said, in Welsh language, but surprisingly, in much of the Welsh language documents, they use the term Welsh costume in English, in quotation marks, amongst the Welsh words, as though it is a concept that is anglicised rather than truly Welsh, which is really interesting. Well, this particular report, of competition at an Eisteddfod actually uses the term dill Cymraeg, Welsh fashion, really. And it's for a competition for women to wear a traditional costume of some sort, of any age. And they decided that the 3 women who entered it should share the £10 prize. So there's a bit in the Welsh language, but not a great deal. Then there are hundreds of pictures. I've found over 700 where the Welsh costume is either dominant or a significant part of the image. And there are many like this. Ibbotson was particularly good because he did a great many really interesting illustrations of costumes. But as we can see from this, when he painted that up in oils, he added a bit of red colour. And we'll see that's significant too. Whether they were wearing red at that time in that place or not, we don't know. I think it's unlikely. And then a large number of prints were produced, mostly for the tourist market. And I think these were very profitable for the artists and the printers. So we have this lovely picture of Market Day in Wales by R. Griffiths in North Wales in 1851. But the colours are not always reliable, as you can see from these 2 illustrations. The woman at the left on the top has got a blue gown, and on the bottom it's a red gown. And the woman in the cloak on the top image is red, and the one in the bottom is blue. And I think the bottom illustration in colouring is probably more correct. These were coloured in almost certainly by somebody in London who'd never been to Wales. We have a quotation from a book written by Robert Hassel Newell for his nephew, with lots of advice on what to draw or paint in Wales. And he says, the dress of the women, a blue cloak and a man's black beaver hat, makes them good figures in the landscape, though a red cloak would be better. And a lot of artists, I think, have taken the right to add a bit of red to a painting, which may not have been there in reality. So we got this example from Brecon with a rather nice red cloak put in. And there are lots of pictures with red cloaks where probably the cloak would have been blue. And we have this interesting cheap print, of which many were produced in the 19th century for tourists. And this one, interestingly, is bilingual. It's got Gwisg Cymraeg, but not a translation, saying hoods and cloaks. But this print is actually sold by somebody in Wales, and he hand colours them in himself during the 19th and late 20th and early 21st century. So this is a modern colouring of a black and white print, and he's not taken any chances here by putting blue and red in. We've got John Cambrian Rowland's wonderful pictures. He came from Ceredigion and then moved up to North Wales, and we've got Llanberis Castle in the background here, showing a range of individuals. The working women, that's the woman on the left, the woman with the satchel, who's a postwoman, and the dairymaid on the right. None of those have the Welsh hat. The 2 women with the Welsh hat are probably well-off farmers' wives and daughters. The daughter, I always think of as being the second from the left, is wearing a green dress and not the traditional costume because she could afford not to. And this sort of mixture of working women and better off farmers' wives and daughters appears in a lot of prints. What's very interesting about this in particular is that the woman on the left is wearing a jacket or possibly a bedgown, but clearly made of wool, I think, which is very, very similar to this doll, which is the doll that was almost certainly presented to Princess Victoria when she came to stay in North Wales for a few months in 1832 at the age of 13. And here is that doll with the interestingly striped gown or jacket with a Welsh hat. And she had Princess Victoria had a very large collection of dolls. Now, what we do know is that when Princess Victoria and her mother travelled through the streets of Bangor at the time of the Eisteddfod there, they wore a Welsh hat in deference to the women of Wales. Sadly, there were no paparazzi around at the time, so we don't know what that hat looked like. But this hat, if we're correct in dating this to 1832, shows that this is the very beginning of the appearance of the Welsh hat, the distinctive Welsh hat, as we'll see. And we studied 40 dolls in great detail, but we found it very, very difficult to date them accurately. But this is just another example. 40 are known in museums and quite a lot in private collections. And one interesting thing about this is that even this is deceptive, because when you lift the apron up, you can see that the skirt has faded at the bottom, but it has bright colours underneath. So we have to be really careful about looking at these things to come to any conclusions. Then also, there are a vast number of photographs from an early photograph like this from the Swansea photographer of 1854, one of the earliest photographs, portrait photographs in Wales, right through to the massive postcards, those produced at the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th, and those then the comic postcards produced in the 40s and 50s as well, all representing Welsh women in costumes. Now, this particular photograph is entitled Garden Girls in the Costume of Glamorgan, but they're not garden girls. They're the photographer's daughters dressed up in Welsh costume. So this is a fake, it's a staged photograph. And nearly all the photographs that we know of are staged, and they're not casual photographs, they've been staged. And many photographers had sets of costumes available for women to put on when they were being photographed. And John Thomas, who produced so many wonderful photographs of Wales in the 1880s and 90s, a little bit later, he clearly had a set of costumes, because I examined the 100 or so photographs he's got of women in Welsh costume, and there's only 3 sets of costumes that appear in those photographs. So he's clearly, they're wearing them and putting them on in his studio for the photograph. So we have to be careful with the photographs. Francis Bedford started taking stereo photographs in Wales in the 1860s, and he produced a lot of women in Welsh costumes too. So there are many, many photographs. And these may be genuine costumes, but it's quite possible that women who are photographed did not normally wear them. We have a few other traces of evidence for costumes. I've seen a great many servants' agreements books. This is what farmers kept to record what he paid their servants and how much he advanced them in their wage for buying whatever they chose to purchase. So in this case, we can see from this list for Anne Williams in 1839, she spent 4 shillings on shoes, paid for stockings, 1 shilling and a penny, which is interesting. Worsted to make a gown working, which I assume is sewing. The tucker, I assume, is a person working in a tucking mill, and I'm not sure what part he played in this. And then another 2 shillings for gown making. So a quarter of her annual wage was spent on clothing. And similarly, we've got records in churchwardens' account books and overseers' account books for providing clothing for the poor. And we've got here in 1846 2 shifts, 1 pinafore, 1 petticoat, and a frock. I have no idea what the frock looked like, but may have been a little bit like a pinafore. And then we have the problem of the myths, which are so well embedded now in some Welsh traditions that it's very, very difficult to shake them off. So you're probably all aware of the French invasion of Fishguard in 1797. And in 1997, the tapestry was created at Fishguard, and on that, that is to mark the invasion of the last invasion of Britain. In that tapestry, they have this picture of women in Welsh red cloaks and Welsh hats. And there is no doubt at all that is not how they were dressed, and that is why they've added the myth to the tapestry, because this is probably what they look like. This is a contemporary drawing, 1797, which says, Lord Calder very judiciously placed a considerable number of women in that dress in the rear of his army, who, being considered by the French army as regular troops, contributed in no small degree to that happy and unexpected surrender. So what the women looked like, they were wearing men's hats, not Welsh hats, and they were wearing red whittles or shawls. And from a distance, they looked like British soldiers, so which scared the French troops into surrender. So that's another myth that we have to look at. The red shawl was known as the Frenchman's terror. And at the first centenary of that event, we have an enormous number of women dressed up in Welsh hats and red cloaks or various other things, which they certainly wouldn't have worn at the time. And it goes even further, because there are now 2 surviving Welsh hats which are claimed to have been owned by Jemima Nichols, who captured some of the Frenchmen. Well, these were not created until 30 years after the event. And the one on the left was sold recently for an exorbitant price to somebody in Australia because it was associated with Jemima Nichols. And that is a complete myth. The other myth is the association of Welsh costume with Lady Llanover, who is supposed to have recorded or possibly said to have invented Welsh costume. What I think she did was commission somebody, not herself, to draw pictures of the costumes worn by her servants. She liked Welsh-speaking servants from much of South Wales. And she then brought those up to date so that she had costume prints for designs for costumes that her friends could wear at the Eisteddfodau that she organised in Abergavenny during the 1840s and 1850s. She also wrote what is become a famous essay for an Eisteddfod on the advantages resulting from the preservation of the Welsh language and national costumes, in plural, of Wales. She won the competition, but there was only one other entry, and that was her godmother, and it's a really poor essay. I have read it. There was a third essay written by a man, which is far better than Lady Llanover's, about Welsh costume, but he didn't finish it in time, so it didn't count, but it was published later on. The thing about the essay is that it doesn't describe costume at all. It just says it's a really good thing to wear because it's hard wearing and locally produced. So she encouraged people to stick to the old traditions and not wear the flimsy cotton costumes, which got cold very easily and soaked. Only a few copies of the essays survive in both languages, and it was printed too small to include the images, because some people think the images were included in that as well, but they certainly weren't. These are 12 of the 13 images that were printed at the time, and we know surprisingly little about these, who printed them and when they were printed and so on. But I have written a whole article on Lady Llanover and these prints, which was published in about 2008 in the National Library of Wales Journal. So there's a lot of detail in there. So there's 2 images of each county, 4 for some. Not one image for each county, as one recent booklet on Welsh costume has suggested. They're all South Wales costumes. But you can see the puffed shoulders on some of them, which I don't think is at all traditional. That's just something that was current at the time Lady Llanover commissioned these pictures to be drawn. So we now look at the various elements of the costume and start off with the hat. And most tourists and many of the artists suggested that women wore men's hats, and that's something that the English women rural women at the time didn't wear. They had their own particular types of hat. In Wales, the women wore men's hats, and we have lots of illustrations like this one of Ibbotson, where all the women and the little girl here too in the foreground are wearing men's hats. The Welsh hat didn't appear until the 1830s, just about the time that Princess Victoria visited North Wales. And there are a very large number of these survive, nearly 400. I've seen about 300 of them and measured and photographed them. 180 are in museums. Ceredigion, my old museum, has the largest number now. Just before I left, I made sure of that. St Fagans has a lot too. And most other museums in Wales have some, and there are one or two in museums in England. In London Museum has one. And then lots are privately owned, and they fetch quite a good price if they're in good condition. They are unique to Wales. They've got the very broad flat brim, which is also unique. You don't get it on any other sort of hat except men's hats in Korea. They're all made of the same materials that top hats are made of. I'll show you that in a moment. And I can't date them very reliably. There's no diagnostic features about them at all to date them accurately. They're made sometime between 1830 and they stopped being made in 1880. And a very few were made after that, especially for harpists who wanted to wear a Welsh hat when they were performing. But they are distinct from the ones made earlier in the century. So it's often thought that Welsh hat, all Welsh hats are slightly conical in shape, and most of them are, in fact. But there are a group from northwest Wales which are straight-sided and shorter than the taller conical ones. And this one we can date to 1875. And I do think it's quite possible that the Welsh hat started in Anglesey or northwest Wales, and then somebody suggested they should be taller and slightly conical. And I don't know who that was. This goes back to that doll that Princess Victoria might have been given, and it's got straight sides. But of course, with the doll's hat, it's so difficult to make a good small example. It might have been a lot easier to make a straight-sided one than a conical one. And there are some very, very odd-looking hats which are handmade for photographs. You can see how badly made these were, and they do look very comical because no one in Wales wore the pointed hat. We now have a new style of hat appearing in pictures, and that, I think, is a result of Ruth Jen, the artist's impressions of Welsh mams, where they have very broad and slightly sloping brims to them. And almost all modern pictures now of Welsh mams have broad sloping brims, and the Welsh hat wasn't like that at all. One of the very strange things I think about Welsh hats is that almost no work had been done on them at all. In fact, when I started looking for information, I found about 3 sentences in all works on Welsh costume that referred to Welsh hats, and they didn't say where they were made, when they were made, and how they were made. And I tried to answer those questions. The first thing is that nearly all the surviving Welsh hats, nearly all 400 of them, were made in England, not in Wales. They were made by 2 firms, Carver & Co, Lakedale & Co in Bristol, and Christie's, the big hat makers who had manufacturers in Stockport, the hat town, where there's now a hat museum, and in London. And I've seen the archives of Christie's, and they do mention Welsh hats, but we know nothing about the firm of Carver & Co. I've failed to find anything on that. And there are a group of hats with a label inside called Mode de Paris. And I do wonder whether people put those in to inflate the prices, to suggest that this was a French hat and not a Welsh one. But they're definitely Welsh hats. They just have this French label inside, which is very peculiar. There are a few hats which I can firmly say were made in Wales. They're made in a very slightly different way to the ones made in England. This one is very definitely made in Wales. It's got a Welsh language label in it, Het Gymreig, a girl's Welsh hat, made by J.M. Jonathan, the hatter and grocer of Llangefni. And this is now in the National Trust's collection. What Marks and Spencers were doing in North Wales at the time, I do not know. I have absolutely no idea what those letters stand for. The Welsh hats are made of silk plush, which was quite difficult to get, and most of it came from France, in the same materials that men's top hats are made of. It's on a linen buckram core, and then that's strengthened and made waterproof with tree resin or shellac. I did actually send samples off of this damaged hat to be sure that we'd identified the materials correctly. So this is made in exactly the same way as as top hats, except on top hats, the underside of the brim is felted, and the underside of women's Welsh hats have silk plush on them. So who wore the Welsh hat? Well, I've come to the conclusion that it is the better off farmers' wives and families, the female family members. Here again, we've got a picture very much like the earlier one I showed, where we've got 3 servants, dairy maids and so on, and then the farmer's wife who's knitting, and the farmer's daughter who has a very nice paisley shawl and probably wearing a dress under an apron. And they're both wearing Welsh hats. Welsh hats were very expensive. In Lady Llanove's time, they cost 16 shillings each, which is possibly 3 weeks' income for a labourer, farm labourer. And they're very fragile indeed. Most women, I think, in Wales would have worn their own fashionable hats. We've got these 2 lovely pictures by John Thomas. He took very, very many superb quality photographs of people in Wales. And here is Sioned and Caddy in their work clothes and in their best clothes, and they probably didn't own a Welsh hat. My feeling is that the Welsh hat was worn by women who sold their goods at market, and they wanted to advertise the fact that they were Welsh and probably Welsh speaking. It was a marketing ploy as much as anything else. And then they would also have worn them at some special events, although not that much at Eisteddfod. If women wore a Welsh costume at an Eisteddfod, especially if she was performing, it was remarked on. And I've read a great many Eisteddfod reports, and it's very rare for them to mention the women wearing Welsh costumes, except to make a little bit of fun of them. The distribution is very interesting too. The majority of the surviving Welsh hats come from the 3 counties of Dyfed. You can see Cardigan has 76 where we can identify the farm or town where they came from, and 14 where they came from, somewhere in the county, but we can't be sure exactly where. Pembroke has 21, Carmarthen 26, and most of the rest have a handful, except Anglesey. I have my suspicions that the large number in Anglesey is because somebody's been actively collecting and they allowed me to see their collection. But you can see Carnarvon only has 8 altogether, and Denbigh has 2, Meirionydd 5. So the majority come from southwest Wales. And all of those hats that I've seen with labels inside them, which had the vendor's name as well as the maker's name, all the vendors come from southwest Wales. So it does look as though the tall, slightly conical Welsh hat is a southwest Wales feature. The shorter, straight-sided hat comes from North Wales. There was another hat that it was proposed should become a national hat when there were plans to have a national costume in the 1880s. And this is the Swansea cockle hat, enabling people to to carry heavy goods on their head. But only one of these survives, and that's this one. It's made of straw, so it's not surprising they haven't survived. Coloured black in this case. And a great many people in Swansea area wore these because they were selling the cockles from the seashore. But that never caught on, although now when you buy a little hat for a girl to be worn on St. David's Day, you can get the Swansea cockle hat as well as the so-called traditional Welsh hat. Most of those are made in the Far East. When did the Welsh hat develop, and how did it develop? And that's another question I can't answer. But we do know that women were wearing broad-brimmed, floppy-brimmed short-crowned hats, and some of them were wearing tall hats with narrow, curved brims. You put those two together and you get a Welsh hat. But I don't know how it happened. Then under the hat, they wore a cap, like the white one in this picture, or a kerchief, like the woman standing up. Both were popular, although it's possible kerchiefs were more popular in Pembrokeshire. The written evidence suggests that, but not many pictures show it because the artists loved to draw pictures of women in caps because they made them look very pretty. So the mob cap is quite rare, and most of the surviving ones are very, very fine indeed. And I suspect that these were the very best and they were kept carefully, whereas the ones worn every day have disappeared. We got these lovely images by J.C. Rowland of Jenny Jones, the famous subject of a song by Matthews, who lived in North Wales for a short time and wrote the song and then made it extremely popular in London. He claimed to have met Jenny Jones, but I asked a genealogist to check whether there's any evidence that Jenny existed, and he couldn't find anything at all. But one of the really interesting things about the mob cap is that it might signify a rite of passage, in that it was only worn by married women and it covered up their hair. Well, Jenny Jones was not married. That's not her husband's surname. So we have a slight conflict here, but it is possible that they wore very ornate hats like this coffered one with the curls around the edge. Because it made her look very attractive, and that's certainly what artists thought at the time. But there's evidence in Scotland and in France that the cap was worn as soon as a woman got married. We got very few pictures of children, as I've said, but this is a lovely picture of a young Welsh woman wearing nothing on her head at all, no man's hat or cap or anything. And that's quite probable what the young women wore at the time. But of course, in some cultures, Muslims, for example, women from puberty wear a hijab, and no male that's not a member of the family is allowed to see her without that. So it is possible that this is a tradition that was prevalent in Wales and other parts of the world, that only married women wore caps. Then we come to the cloak, and as I've suggested, the cloaks generally were blue. Nearly all the written descriptions suggest the cloaks were blue, but many of the pictures have them shown as red, as I said earlier on. That was artistic license to add a bit of bright colour to the landscape. There are a few surviving red cloaks, but they're really poor, and I think most of them are late 19th century or early 20th, made for girls to wear on St. David's Day or for choirs to wear when they were performing, and occasionally for Eisteddfodau. We do actually have a photograph of a woman in a cloak that she wore at Eisteddfodau, and it's green, and she made it specially for herself, so she chose that colour. We know that Price Jones of Newtown, with his mail order catalogue, he was the first person to send things through the post on sale. His catalogue shows that he sold women's scarlet royal cloaks with hoods, as supplied to Her Majesty the Queen, also in cardinal and blue. And this appears in quite a few of his catalogues. Now, in 2008, when I did the big exhibition on Welsh costumes in the National Library of Wales, somebody contacted me and said that they had a box full of Welsh costume. Would I like to have a look at it in case it would be useful for the exhibition? So I went up to Anglesey to look at it, and she showed me all this wonderful stuff in a box. And then there was a bit of red fabric in the bottom. And I said, "What's that?" And she said, "Oh, that's a bit of rubbish. You won't be interested in that." It was one of these cloaks with Price Jones's label in it. And she won't let go of it now. Lots of people have asked her for it, and she wants to keep it because it's unique. As far as I know, that's the only surviving example anywhere. But it is a rather nasty thing. It's very, very thin. It wouldn't keep you warm. It certainly wouldn't keep you dry, and it doesn't look attractive. And it was made by him almost certainly for events of various sorts. Then we come to the shawl. Whoops, sorry. And the shawl, of course, is ubiquitous. It's something you'd find in almost any culture. It's an extremely practical, simple item, but the majority of shawls worn by women in working conditions were almost certainly natural colours, blacks, greys, whites and creams, without any dye in them. The ornamental shawls worn for special occasions, of course, are much more coloured. The shawls were not worn over the head like Irish women did, and possibly some women in Scotland too. They very rarely seen worn in that way. Here we've got a group of working women in a field. I'm still not absolutely sure what they were doing. They all have short sticks in their hands. They've got shawls worn in two ways, either folded in a triangular form or rectangular. They can be tucked into the top of the apron so they can be held down. They're double thickness, so they're really warm and probably quite waterproof. But these women are also wearing kerchiefs over their hats, which of course are men's working hats. And the men don't have kerchiefs over their hats. The fine shawl, like this one, the Paisley shawl, is often associated with Wales for a very good reason, which I'll show you in a moment. The origin of these designs comes from Kashmir. A lot were imported in the early 18th century and were enormously expensive until they started to learn how to weave them in Norwich and then Edinburgh and then finally in Paisley. But Paisley then discovered that they could be printed on cotton. And as soon as that happened, the better off women stopped wearing these because they didn't want to be seen wearing something like the shawls that their maidservants could have worn. So the reason that they're associated with Wales is this picture, which shows Sian Owen in her own shawl in her cottage, and a shawl that she had to borrow for this painting, which is very famous because it's meant to have the devil represented in it. But this is what made the Association of Welsh Costume and the Paisley shawl very famous, because Leverhulme bought this for the Sunlight Art Gallery, and then hundreds were given away to members of the era, or you could buy them for very small sums of money, or if you bought £7 of soap, you could get a free copy of that print. So that's where the association came from. And then the other sort of shawl that's linked with Wales is the shawl Maggie, worn throughout Wales. I used to think that it was only found in South Wales, but there's lots of evidence from people who remember their mothers wearing these to carry people's brothers and sisters and sometimes themselves into the 1970s. So there's good evidence that this is unique, almost unique to Wales, to be worn on the front, and it's known as the Welsh method of carrying a baby. All the shawls are really big, they have very long tassels, and they're a very soft fabric. And it's a custom that was adopted by Black people living in Cardiff. So it's a Welsh tradition that crossed the cultural boundaries, which I find very interesting. Because in Africa, generally, babies are carried on the back rather than on the front. And then there's this very sad postcard photograph clearly showing a young girl, I think, probably carrying her little brother or sister in a shawl, and clearly showing that she has both hands free so that they can do other things while holding the baby. Then we come to the gown, which is unique to Wales pretty well. I'm sure it's the sort of thing that was worn by many people in the 17th and 18th century, but we've got very little documentary evidence for it. It's very unusual design with a very long tail and then these flaps on the front with no fixings. They may have been held together with a thorn or a pin of some sort. They have short sleeves, and all the surviving ones, of which I know of 80, have the watered silk on the arms, and they're all almost certainly late 19th, early 20th century, made for various events. They all are of the same sort of fabric, but every single one, the pattern of the stripes is different. So they're not all produced in one mill for, say, a large choir. Every single one is slightly different. They are superbly made. They have a very wide tail with gauze sewn in between the sides and the back on both sides. You can see that clearly. And the seamstry is superb. It's very, very fine. So this has been done by a seamstress rather than, I think, the makers themselves. And they're all very distinct, and you only find them associated with Cardiganshire and Carmarthenshire, nowhere else. You might get blue ones further north, but not these red striped ones. They're very distinctive too, those two counties. I did take one apart because there were so many, and somebody gave me one, and I did want to see how it had been cut out. This is all one piece of fabric, which is very interesting indeed. So there's no joints in that. And then they bring together the middle of the tail to form a pleat, and then that brings the two halves of the back together. And then you have all the other pieces stuck on in various ways. So there's some very skillful cutting and design and seamstressry on this, which makes them really quite unusual. Here is a drawing of exactly that sort of gown, but it's 1830. This is one of the pictures commissioned by Lady Llanover. It's exactly what the surviving costumes are. And it is possible that those surviving costumes were based on these drawings, but I've got no evidence for that. And this is what the fabric looks like because it's heavily felted to make it waterproof and really tough. But as I say, the patterns of the stripes on all the different gowns that I've seen are different. Then in Pembrokeshire, they wore something which I called a jacket. It's rather like the bedgown, but it has a much shorter tail to it, short sleeves. And this is also amongst the pictures commissioned by Lady Llanover. But we do have some examples surviving, only two in this case, one in Pembrokeshire Museum, one in St Fagans. And they're very fine, and again, made for special events at the late 19th, early 20th century. But written documents strongly suggest that this is the style worn in Pembrokeshire at the time. Plain coloured, not striped, browns or reds. And again, you can see some superb sewing on it. Very fine work indeed. Then in South Wales, South East Wales, we have a costume known as a bedgown, which is rather like a kimono. It's T-shaped, very loose, no fixing on the front, very comfortable to wear, I suspect. This is, again, one of the pictures commissioned by Lady Llanover, but it has puff sleeves, and none of the surviving examples or drawings suggest that the ordinary women in Wales were wearing puff sleeves in this way. This is one of the surviving examples at St Fagans, and you can see it's like a kimono with a T-shape and then gauze sewn into the armpits to give the bit of freedom there. But no fixings, no buttons or hooks or anything to hold it together, because it could be held together quite well with the apron. And then in North Wales, they have a very similar bedgown with a very large collar. And again, mostly short sleeves. Incidentally, the definition of a bedgown is something you don't wear, is an item you wear anywhere except in bed. Where the term came from, we don't know. I suspect that goes back to the better off women wearing something in their bedrooms before they came down in their big houses, perhaps to receive visitors. And then, of course, servants would have had some of those and copied them. They may have become popular in that way. But you can see the picture of 1835 shows exactly the same as this surviving example in Bangor Museum. And similarly, in this picture, which we've already seen, this maidservant on the right is wearing exactly the same type of bedgown. And a recent discovery, I was excited to find this, is a detail of a picture of the interior of a cottage with a woman wearing a blue and white printed cotton bedgown in exactly the same style. Aprons are more or less ubiquitous, and again, generally natural colours if they're for workwear, and more decorative if they're for special occasions. And then, as I mentioned earlier, they wore separate sleeves, which could be worn when required if they were doing particularly dirty work or it was cold, and then they can be taken off and washed easily, whereas the gowns, especially if they're made of wool, were much more difficult to clean and were often, I suspect, brush dried rather than washed. So these could, mostly cotton. Most of the surviving ones are very decorative and worn for special occasions. Again, they would have been very plain when working in the fields. Underwear is something we got almost nothing written about, but we do have this comment from a man in 1827 saying, few or none of them, that is the rural working women, wore linen or cotton. Their chemises were of flannel, which must have been very itchy. And in some instances, a flannel waistcoat served the purpose of a chemise. None of them wore stays, which is an article of dress altogether unused by peasantry. There are illustrations of rural working women in England wearing stays, and the only times you find Welsh women wearing stays is on the stage in London, and illustrations of them on the stage, because Welsh women were quite popular in drama in England, and they were often represented in Welsh costume of some sort. And here we've got this illustration again, the Ibbotson Llanrwst Bridge, and you can see this lady's chemise, and it's a V-shaped sort of T-shirt, I suspect, but it is one of those rare occasions where you can see the underwear more clearly. Then underskirts, when the women wore the gown, they often had a skirt of exactly the same material, but most women had a great choice of fabrics, mostly vertically striped, very rarely horizontally striped, often in blacks and reds, but there's an enormous variety of fabrics and textures of the fabric as well. And we can't date these, almost impossible to date. Some people would say they could identify the mill they were made, but I find that very difficult to believe. So stripes are very common in much of Wales, but around Swansea and Neath, they wore a check. And there's good evidence for this from various sources now. This is William Young's Guide to the Beauties of Glyn Neath, showing the Glyn Neath plies. But we have other illustrations from the same area. This is a cousin of the Swansea photographer, William Henry Fox Talbot, and she showed these three young women wearing checks, whereas the older woman, who's taking her shoes off, because they didn't wear shoes until they got to market and took them off as they left market to go home, she's wearing stripes. And then we have Lady Llanover, assuming that the checks were common throughout Wales, and she actually organised a competition for weavers to make the traditional Welsh check. There were no entries because there is no traditional Welsh check, but she had her own weaver make check designs to her own patterns. And we got some of those surviving because when Winifred Cwm Tennant, who was the mistress of the robes for the Eisteddfod, wanted to design some new robes for Eisteddfod wear, she asked whether any checks could be found, and one of her friends found some, but said they couldn't be got from any mills anywhere now. And these were all made at Lady Llanover's own factory at Gwenfrwd. Then we come to stockings. If a woman had nothing else to do with her hands in Wales, the chances are she was knitting. And stockings were produced in vast numbers, probably millions, and most of them sold through middlemen to England and beyond. It said that soldiers wore these, and because Welsh stockings made of the right wool were extremely hard wearing. Many women didn't wear stockings at all or shoes when going to or from market, which is when the tourists saw them. But if they did wear stockings, they wore footless stockings, as is shown in this picture of the woman on the right. So the stockings cover their legs down to the top of their feet, and there's a little hook on the end which goes over one of the toes to stop it riding up. None of those stockings survive, but a few of the ordinary stockings do survive because they were made especially for burial of the maker, the knitter, probably, and they got the name of the person for whom they were made and knitted into the top. And there's 3 or 4 of those in Tregaron and some in St Vagans, but very, very few survive of any form. So that describes the various elements of the Welsh costume, and I'm very briefly going to describe how I think it developed. As I suggested at the beginning, the original costume came out of something that was traditional. People didn't think about it, so it was unconscious. You just wore what your mother or grandmother wore. And it's unique to Wales. It's what the tourists noted as being something that they didn't see in any other part of the UK or abroad. In 1881, the Prince of Wales came to Swansea to open the new docks, and it was suggested by local entrepreneurs, most of them, I suspect, woolen manufacturers, that the people who welcomed him in Swansea should wear a distinctive Welsh costume, both the men and the women, because they wanted to sell their fabrics and the market was disappearing. So they wanted a national costume that would be recognised as being distinctively Welsh. In the end, only a choir wore the distinctive Welsh costume with the Welsh hat. But the Illustrated London News illustrated the distinctive costumes that were still being worn by women in Swansea at that time. So this is the beginning of the development of the national costume. And this sort of costume was being worn by middle class and probably upper class women for special events like Eisteddfodau and choir festivals and that sort of thing. It had gone out of use by the rural working women almost completely, and that's why they wanted to preserve it in some form. The wearing of Welsh costume on St David's Day by little girls doesn't seem to date to much before 1910. I can't find any evidence before that date. And this photograph is slightly later than that date. But it certainly became very popular, and I have no idea why it was first introduced or how it spread. But it's now, of course, ubiquitous. Almost every school in Wales has the smaller girls wearing a traditional Welsh costume. And there's my daughter, who's now 38, wearing it while she was at school. And then the other big change that occurred was because the first international Eisteddfod at Llangollen, held in 1947, brought in people from all over the world wearing fantastic costumes, the women in particular, superbly created and decorated costumes, whereas at the time, the Welsh costume was rather simple and rather basic. So when the person who taught the dances wrote a booklet on the dances, her first edition contained nothing about costume, but she almost immediately printed a second edition, which contains a few pages about the different sorts of costumes that could be worn. And it's from this time that the distinctive national costume becomes really recognisable, with plain red, not striped red skirts, and a light fabric for the gowns, Welsh hat, of course, the frilled cap, and the introduction of lace, which doesn't appear in this photograph, but it appears on a lot of dance groups at the International Eisteddfod and elsewhere at Eisteddfodau. And a little bit of lace stuck into the top of Welsh hat appears at this time too. So I'm going to finish there. And if you want to know more, there is a ridiculous amount of information on the subject on my website called welshhat.wordpress.com. Which includes a lot of illustrations and enormous detail about the various elements of the costume and all the written descriptions that I found certainly not all the photographs, because I haven't got copyright on those. So thank you for listening.